We never really think about clothing, this familiar, everyday part of our daily lives. It feels like it has always existed, accompanying humanity since time immemorial. Official science paints a neat picture for us. First, primitive humans walked completely naked. Then, searching for protection from the cold, they wrapped themselves in rough animal skins, and after some time, they supposedly learned how to make fabrics. But if we stop and try to look closely at this process, we discover that behind an ordinary shirt or dress lies a technological mystery that scientists still cannot clearly explain. This entire historical scenario begins to fall apart the moment we ask a simple question. How could beings with no understanding of textiles suddenly master an extremely complex production cycle? Creating fabric is not just about weaving together a few flexible branches. It is a high-tech process that requires deep knowledge of agronomy, chemistry, and mechanics. Imagine a group of people living in caves. According to textbooks, they not only had to notice the potential of wild flax or cotton for making clothing, but also organize full-scale production. To obtain even a single piece of linen fabric, hundreds of kilograms of seeds must be collected and prepared for sowing. But first, a suitable field must be found, cleared of centuries-old trees and shrubs, stumps uprooted, and the land plowed, all without any metal tools. Where would a forest dweller get an understanding of plant growth cycles and the skill of selective breeding? Even if we assume the harvest was gathered, the real difficulties are just beginning. Flax must be cut correctly, dried, soaked in water, then beaten, combed, and drawn out for a long time. But even then, it is not yet yarn. The raw material requires thermal and chemical processing. It must be boiled and bleached to become suitable for further work. Only after this does spinning begin, which requires spindles or even more complex devices. And the culmination of this entire chain is the loom, a complex mechanical machine that demands precise engineering calculations. It is impossible to assemble it from sticks and mud, because it must ensure even thread tension and rhythmic shuttle movement. Historians wave away these arguments, claiming that progress happened gradually. But technologies of this level cannot appear in fragments. Without developed agriculture, you have no raw materials. Without metallurgy, you cannot create loom components. Without chemistry, you cannot produce durable fabric. All these elements must arise simultaneously, as a single system. Instead of acknowledging this complexity, we are asked to believe absurd fairy tales about wild tribes using fish bones instead of needles. Try to imagine sewing a proper, fitted dress from dense fabric using a bone that lacks the flexibility and strength of metal. Such a tool would break at the first effort, not to mention the impossibility of making a tiny eye for thread without specialized tools. Logic suggests that a person cannot create something they have no concept of until they are shown a prototype or taught the technology. Take a blank sheet of paper and try to draw something that has never existed on Earth, and you will understand how hard it is to go beyond what is known. If official science misleads us even about the origin of ordinary clothing, then the scale of distortion in the history of entire civilizations could be truly enormous. We are told about linear development, but the facts suggest that ancient peoples suddenly possessed technologies we still struggle to reproduce today. Before we move on to the main mystery of our past and explore why progress itself looks like an anomaly, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Here we search for truths that textbooks won't show you. We are used to trusting authorities, but what if our entire chronicle is just stage scenery in a grand game, with rules written long before we appeared? Understanding how our reality truly works begins with doubting the simplest things. And if the foundation of history is clothing that no one could have invented, it's worth asking what the rest of our knowledge of the past is really built on. To fully grasp the depth of this contradiction, it's enough to look at the world around us today. Official history claims that humanity went through a long and difficult evolutionary path, gradually moving from stone axes to spacecraft. We're told this progress was natural and inevitable. Yet our planet still contains living evidence that this theory doesn't hold up. There are tribes that have remained in complete isolation for thousands of years, and their lives are a frozen reflection of the very Stone Age we supposedly emerged from on our own. The most striking example is the inhabitants of Sentinel Island. These people live in total isolation, aggressively rejecting any contact with outside civilization. According to all historical logic, over the thousands of years they spent on their land, they should have produced their own geniuses, inventors, and reformers. But this never happened. They still use arrowheads made from bone fragments or stone, survive by hunting and gathering, and make no attempt to engage in agriculture or weaving. Their way of life hasn't changed at all. They eat the same food their ancestors did thousands of years ago, and sleep in the same primitive shelters. And there are dozens of such isolated communities on Earth. Why don't they develop? Why, over many centuries, haven't they discovered metal smelting or even the simplest sail? The answer is frighteningly simple and completely destroys the official version of our past. A human cannot create something they have no concept of. Human creativity is always a recombination of already known elements. We cannot invent something from absolute nothing. If a person is not shown that metal can be extracted from stone using fire, they will never figure it out on their own, no matter how many millions of years they live near ore deposits. For them, stone will remain just stone. The theory that an ancient hunter suddenly had a flash of insight to build a mill or invent writing is a beautiful fairy tale with nothing to do with reality. If humanity truly developed the way textbooks claim, we would all still be in the Stone Age, running through forests with spears. No natural intuition will tell you how to build a complex machine or calculate the movement of stars. Progress is not an innate property of the human species. It is an anomaly that contradicts the observed behavior of all isolated human groups. Look at the colossal gap between the lifestyle of any wild tribe and modern civilization. This abyss could not have been crossed through the simple accumulation of random guesses. It becomes obvious that all the achievements we are so proud of are not the result of our own evolution. Someone or something must have given the initial push, shown an example, taught the technologies, or implanted ready-made knowledge. But if we couldn't come up with all this ourselves, where did our technologies really come from? Why did time freeze at a primitive level in some parts of the planet, while in others an unimaginable leap occurred? The answer may be far stranger and more disturbing than any historian's fantasy. Perhaps the key to this mystery lies not in deep antiquity, but in events of the last 30 years, when the world changed at such speed that it looks more like a software glitch than a natural process. Look closely at the incredible speed at which our world has changed in recent decades. If we plot humanity's technological development on a timeline, we see a disturbing picture. For thousands of years, the line barely rose above zero, remaining almost flat, and then, in a single moment by historical standards, it shot straight upward. Just 30 or 40 years ago, a push-button phone was the ultimate dream. And today, we carry in our pockets computing power that surpasses all of NASA's computers from the lunar program era. We are used to calling this scientific and technological progress, but if we stop and think, this leap looks extremely suspicious. Think about it. For centuries, people used horses as their main means of transportation and candles as their only source of light. Generation after generation lived and died without seeing any fundamental changes in daily life. And suddenly, as if by magic, the world was flooded with computers, tablets, smartphones, drones, and electric cars. How did this happen? We are told it's the product of the collective genius of scientists. But did the human brain really evolve so much in just 30 years to make such an incredible leap? As we already established, a person cannot create something they have no concept of. To invent a modern processor, it's not enough to just be smart. You need a massive foundation of existing knowledge in quantum physics, materials chemistry, and photolithography. It feels as though everything we have today, from the internet to advanced neural networks, is not the result of a long and painful human search. It looks more like characters in a video game suddenly unlocked new skill trees or received a massive system update. It's as if we were handed ready-made blueprints and instructions and began assembling the world of the future without fully understanding how its fundamental principles work. Take a modern smartphone and try to recreate it from scratch, starting with mining ore and ending with writing software, and you'll realize this is impossible for one person, or even a group, without an existing industrial infrastructure. And that infrastructure appeared almost instantly. Such an unnatural technological explosion suggests that our civilization is under external control, or living within a predefined scenario. We accept these gifts without asking too many questions, just as we accept history textbooks on faith. But if it's so easy to convince us that the sudden appearance of smartphones is natural, how easy was it to convince us of false ideas about what happened 100 or 200 years ago? Modern technology dazzles us, making us believe that people in the past had the same miraculous ability to create complex things out of nothing. But the moment we look away from glowing screens and glance back at the romantic wooden sailing ships, we find an even bolder and larger deception. Behind beautiful stories of naval battles and great discoveries lie technical inconsistencies that official science prefers to ignore, hoping we'll never ask uncomfortable questions about saws, planks, and metal. This leap into the future feels like magic, but the magic of the past, upon closer inspection, turns out to be nothing more than crude stage props. The history we are taught is filled with images of majestic wooden fleets, white sails, and grand naval battles. We are told that tens of thousands of ships sailed the seas and oceans, transporting goods, armies, and explorers. But if we strip away the romantic haze and try to imagine the actual shipyards of the time, we find a technical void. Official science confidently reports the number of ships built, while carefully avoiding the question, how exactly, from what materials, and with what tools were they created in the absence of an industrial base? Building a single large ship requires enormous resources. Recall the complexity of fabric production we discussed earlier. To equip just one medium-sized vessel, thousands of square meters of sailcloth and tens of kilometers of strong ropes are needed. To supply an entire fleet with sails, you would need not village spinning wheels, but gigantic textile factories operating non-stop. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The main issue lies in the ship's hull itself. A ship is not a raft of tied logs. It is an extremely complex engineering structure made of thousands of perfectly fitted planks. Here we face an unsolvable paradox. How, in distant times when humanity supposedly had no advanced metallurgy, did people manage to saw planks? To turn a massive tree trunk into an even, thin, flexible board, you need a saw. Not a small handsaw, but a large, two-man saw, or even a mechanical sawmill. But to make such a saw, you need high-quality sheet steel. Producing steel of that quality is impossible without metallurgical plants, blast furnaces, rolling mills, and coal and ore mines. This is a closed technological loop. To build a wooden ship, you first need heavy industry. Historians claim ancient craftsmen used axes. But try making even one straight 5-centimeter thick plank from a huge oak with an axe. You'd spend weeks on a single piece while turning 80% of the valuable wood into useless chips. Building a fleet this way would take centuries and require millions of people working on one task. Yet we're told ships were mass-produced in every coastal city. Where did measuring tools, blueprints, and quality standards come from? Without developed machine building and precise engineering, creating a seaworthy vessel capable of surviving ocean storms becomes impossible. This entire myth of mass wooden shipbuilding collapses the moment we calculate the real labor and resources required. Either the stories of great maritime powers are wildly exaggerated, or the technologies of the time were nothing like what we're told. We are expected to believe that magnificent galleons and frigates appeared out of nowhere, built by carpenters with primitive tools. But even if we momentarily accept that these ships somehow existed, another, even more absurd question arises. How were they operated in real seas? The reality of the legendary Vikings, supposedly roaming the oceans in open vessels, was far less heroic and far more physically impossible than movies and novels suggest. How could a handful of people contend with the forces of nature on ships that technically could not exist in that era? When we move from construction paradoxes to major historical events, the absurdity of the official narrative becomes even clearer. We are told about great conquerors whose armies crossed continents, subjugating peoples and founding empires. The most famous example is Genghis Khan and his legendary army of 300,000. In textbooks, this looks like a majestic march of unstoppable force. But let's apply basic logic and biology. To feed such a massive number of people during long campaigns, they would have needed at least 1 million head of livestock, sheep, and horses. Now imagine this enormous living river trying to move through the endless Siberian taiga. There are no roads, no prepared routes, only fallen trees, impassable swamps, and dense undergrowth. How did this horde move at all? And an even more important question, how did they cross the great Siberian rivers, some of which are several kilometers wide? History is silent on how 300,000 warriors and millions of animals crossed raging waters without bridges or engineering structures. Swimming such distances in icy water is impossible for humans and livestock on that scale. We are simply asked to believe they somehow crossed, without considering logistics that would challenge even a modern army with pontoon bridges and aviation. The saga of northern seafarers looks no less strange. Vikings supposedly sailed the Atlantic in their famous longships and even reached America. A longship is essentially a large open boat with no deck or enclosed spaces. Imagine people spending weeks in the open ocean on such a vessel. Where did they sleep? How did they cook food without space for a hearth and dry firewood? Constant exposure to cold rain and icy winds, with no way to warm up or dry off, would quickly exhaust the human body. Official versions depict rowers working in perfect unison for hours. But anyone who has ever handled a boat knows that in rough seas, synchronized rowing becomes impossible. When some oars are lifted into the air while others plunge deep into water, forward motion stops. Each oar is extremely heavy, and the energy required demands enormous calories that could not be stored on an open vessel. This is a biological dead end. Humans cannot work to exhaustion without sleep and hot food, while constantly suffering from hypothermia. This heroic chronicle of conquests and discoveries ignores basic biological needs and the laws of physics. We are shown beautiful battle scenes and romantic voyages, hiding their physical impossibility. In reality, no such history ever existed in the form we are presented. We live in a world where the past was constructed and implanted into our consciousness in finished form. If these campaigns were physically and logistically impossible, then the maps of these routes are nothing more than skillful forgeries. But if that's true, an even more intriguing question arises. Who and how managed to draw such detailed maps of vast territories and oceans in times when there were no aircraft, satellites, or precise navigation instruments. If the logistics of ancient armies and fleet construction without industry seem like fairy tales, ancient cartography is undeniable proof of a massive technical hoax. We take old maps for granted, imagining brave sailors hugging coastlines, measuring distances, and sketching outlines on parchment. But try a simple experiment. Take a sheet of paper, go into a dense forest or along a rugged coastline, and attempt to draw an accurate map. You'll quickly realize that without rising above the land and seeing it from above, your sketches will be wildly inaccurate. You won't maintain proportions or capture river bends or coastline curves because your horizon is limited. To create a map that claims accuracy, you must be in the air. This isn't a matter of convenience. It's a fundamental requirement of geometry and geodesy. Official science claims ancient cartographers relied on compasses and spyglasses. But a compass shows direction, not distance or complex topography. A spyglass won't reveal the shape of an archipelago or river delta 30 kilometers away. To link thousands of points into a single, mathematically precise coordinate grid requires advanced instruments and knowledge of the planet's true shape. Geodesy demands accurate chronometers for longitude and advanced optics for triangulation, none of which supposedly existed in the past. Yet we find maps dated centuries ago that astonish with their precision. They depict continents not yet discovered with remarkable detail. Their coastlines match modern satellite data within a few kilometers. How could people in wooden boats, without radios or time synchronization, achieve this? The academic answer, they were very diligent, sounds like a weak attempt to hide the obvious. Diligence cannot replace the absence of aviation and orbital sensors. All this leads to a conclusion that shatters our worldview. These maps were never created by people of that era. They are too perfect, too systematic, and lack the errors inevitable in manual copying and primitive measurement. Most likely, ancient maps are the product of a highly advanced intelligence, possibly artificial, that shaped the geographic framework of our reality. These documents were not drawn by sailors. They were implanted into history in finished form to create the illusion of a deep past and explored world. They resemble textures in a global digital simulation, loaded in advance so the player never doubts the reality of the environment. When you realize that even the geography of our past is a technological artifact, the entire structure of human knowledge begins to tremble. If the clothes we wear, the ships we supposedly built, and the lands we supposedly conquered are part of a carefully scripted scenario supported by impossible maps, only one step remains to a shocking truth. All these technical contradictions, logical gaps, and historical anomalies lead to one conclusion. Our history is not what it seems. We are not the authors of our chronicle. We are characters inside a grand structure whose rules were written by someone else. Welcome to the game. We have arrived at the most frightening yet logical explanation for all the oddities found in fabrics, ships, and maps of our past. If history falls apart when tested by physics and logistics, then history as we know it never existed. We are inside a vast artificial system, a global matrix or high-tech game, where everything, from city architecture to memories in our heads, was created and uploaded relatively recently. We were placed into this world already complete, supplied with an ancient chronicle so we wouldn't ask unnecessary questions about our origins. In this system, most people function as non-player characters, NPCs. If you closely examine the structure of life for the majority of Earth's population, you'll see a rigid algorithm that's nearly impossible to escape. A child is born, goes to kindergarten, then school, university, spends half their life working, retires, and waits for the end of their life cycle. It's a predictable, cyclical program devoid of true free will. 90% of people simply follow predefined tracks, keeping the system running and never questioning the scenery around them. The remaining 10% are what could be called real players. These are forces that control processes, reshape landscapes, and set development vectors. In our perception, they often appear as opposing sides, light and dark forces. All our history of wars and conflicts is just a reflection of their moves on this global game board. When one side achieves final victory, or the scenario reaches a dead end, the world is reset. The system reboots, a new iteration of reality is created, and we, the characters, receive a new package of past explaining why the world looks the way it does. The designers of this reality did immense work. They painted magnificent images of past centuries, erected majestic ruins, and filled museums with artifacts so we would believe in generational continuity. We were given the false confidence that we are the result of long evolution, when in fact, we may have appeared here just yesterday, complete with memories and habits. History is not humanity's path. It's just a colorful background needed to make the game feel deep and meaningful. We accept these props on faith because our perception program doesn't allow us to see the seams in this digital canvas. But any simulation, no matter how perfect, leaves traces. The code sometimes glitches, and objects appear in the material world that don't fit the legend of a primitive past. We can debate simulation theory endlessly, but is there proof more tangible than thought experiments? Yes, and it stands right in the middle of our rivers, challenging official science and reminding us that the construction technologies of the past were either impossible or belonged to a completely different reality, hidden behind textbooks. To finally see the man-made nature of the illusion we call history, it's enough to look at structures without which no civilization, trade route, or conquest could exist. Bridges. Official chronicles are full of accounts of massive movements of people, goods, and armies between countries and continents. But such movement is physically impossible without reliable river crossings. If great empires truly existed, they must have been able to build bridges. Yet the moment we move from theory to engineering practice, we hit another technological wall. Let's examine what bridge construction really involves, specifically building supports in a riverbed. This is one of the most difficult engineering tasks even today. Modern methods use caissons or steel cylinders. First, a massive cylinder is welded from high-strength steel sheets, often over 10 meters in diameter and 20 meters high. This multi-ton structure is delivered by special barges and lowered to the riverbed using powerful cranes. Industrial pumps then remove water from inside, creating a dry workspace. Only then can workers pour massive amounts of concrete, install reinforcement, and gradually build a support capable of withstanding enormous loads. Now ask yourself, did ancient Greeks, Romans, or medieval builders have this equipment? Such work requires advanced metallurgy to produce sheet steel and welding equipment, energy sources to power massive pumps, industrial-scale concrete production, and heavy lifting machinery. Official history claims ancient civilizations had only slave labor and primitive tools. But no number of slaves can pump water from a flooded riverbed or hold a steel cylinder steady in a strong current. Slave labor does not override hydraulics or structural mechanics. If ancient bridge supports stand in riverbeds, it means only one thing. They could not have been built within the slave-owning or feudal systems described in textbooks. Either they are traces of a civilization whose technology surpassed ours, or, more likely, given everything discussed, they are part of the original architecture of our simulation. They were not built through decades of grueling labor, but simply loaded into the landscape, along with rivers and forests, to create a believable inhabited world. All those Spartans, crusaders, and great commanders of the past are nothing more than fictional characters, for whom reality designers prepared matching scenery. In real physical conditions, there was simply no space for them to exist. All this confirms the only working theory. There was no history. We are inside a complex, constantly updated system. Our past is not a chain of real events, but a design project meant to hide the true nature of our existence. The world resets and rewrites itself whenever the global conflict between players reaches its conclusion, and we wake up again in a new antiquity, surrounded by artifacts no one could have created. The world is far more complex and fascinating than it seems, and behind its familiar facade lie mechanisms we are not meant to know. But if you made it this far and felt the weight of these contradictions, something important has shifted in your program. It's a sign you are not just an NPC blindly following a path. You can see the seams in the fabric of reality. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with those who are ready to wake up, and stop believing the fairy tales used to lull us to sleep. It's time to ask questions the system has no answers for.